story.
PowerPoint was just fine.
Okay, perfect. So what I wanted to focus on, I wanted to again focus on the malignancy in the family, just to get us started. And I'll be very brief, everyone. You'll see that I have slides that are quite detailed, but I'll just hit them, hit some essentials, because what I want to focus on are the question of housewives, mothers, and maybe even parents in Psycho and in Alfred Hitchcock cinema. Do you remember the ending, everyone, when we have Norman? Is it Norman or is it the mother? I'm so happy we have a psychiatrist and many psychiatrists, Anthony, to help us break this down. But do you remember that ending when she goes, "Why? She wouldn't even hurt a fly," And I really find that to be really intriguing. This tension between surface and interior, and again the way in which the housewife, again performed by Norman Bates, so that maybe does complicate this, but I think it is an interesting it offers an interesting vantage point to think about the haunting qualities of family. And so, just very briefly, my goals will be for this brief series of notes, just noting Hitchcock as an auteur. I want to highlight for everyone that he offers us a very implicating cinema, in his own words. And so, will it explore the close relationship of parents and children? Just for time, everyone, I won't show clips, though you'll see in the PowerPoint, and Anthony, I'm happy to share that with you afterwards. For at least one scene, there's a clip from Psycho that we can all look at. So we'll explore this close relationship, as well as the interesting figure of the housewife. And to do this, who may have an innocent facade, but who may also be driven by all-consuming appetites, violent appetites. So we'll move between Hitchcock's own commentary, Psycho, the 1960 film, and I would just say parenthetically, Anthony, watching this movie, it is. I've seen it so many times, but it is engrossing. Particularly the Bates performance, and by the Anthony Perkins performance as Norman Bates, just stunning in terms of how he's giving us a very regressed masculinity, or performing a regressed masculinity, and sort of cycling between various personas. So we'll look at Psycho. I'll just hit the television show Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and I'll also use as an example the penultimate film by Hitchcock, which is Frenzy, which is his only R-rated film. It's for those who think he's a very buttoned-up filmmaker and doesn't show violence, it's a particularly distressing film, but I think a valuable perch to think about his psychic obsessions and interests. So how, we might ask, does Psycho encourage us to question the malignancies in our own lives, in our families and ourselves, when we may claim we wouldn't hurt a fly? So again, I think this film is interesting because of the way it highlights the possibility that within a sight of norms, of normative relationships, there can be violent tensions, repressed sexualities, all emerging in that space. So Hitchcock, the quintessential auteur, for those who might not be familiar with the term, auteur comes from auteur theory, or French for author, where the director is the sole artist responsible for a film. And the auteur theory, some have criticized it, but subordinates the importance of others in creating a film in relationship to the director. And people like Francois Truffaut, who heralded Hitchcock cinema, who was seen as a Hollywood filmmaker for much of his career, one without artistic interest, but the French, with auteur theory, sort of underlined that this person was an important film author. He outranks the rest, Truffaut noted, because he's the most complete filmmaker of all. He's not only merely an expert at some specific aspect of cinema, but an all-around specialist who excels at every image, every shot, and every scene. He masterminds the construction of the screenplay, as well as the photography, the cutting, the soundtrack, has creative ideas and everything, and can handle anything, and is even, as we already know, expert at publicity. Indeed, Hitchcock was known during his moment just as much as a showman, and as being very much the first director that we associated, that the studio would ask us to associate with his films, in the same way that Anthony Christopher Nolan is often positioned above Batman or Interstellar. We know Nolan, we come for him. So uh, this is from the Lee essay. This next quote I'm just going to highlight. Hitchcock has a distinctive style of his own. He is undoubtedly one of the few filmmakers on the horizon today whose a screen signature can be identified as soon as the picture begins. That's a truthful quote from the Lee essay. And so as we're thinking about this, and Anthony will take questions once, and I imagine share thoughts following our chance to share comments, both of us. Either from Psycho or your writer knowledge of Hitchcock, what do you see, everyone, as Hitchcock's signature? And I think for me, Hitchcock's cinema is an implicating one. Film critic Pascal Bonitzer noted that Hitchcock's cinema is about the presence of a stain on normality that clashes against all, quote, routines that are ordinary, even humdrum and unthinking. Bonitzer describes how Hitchcock accentuates this corrosive force inexorably linked with death, the stain, by relying on picture postcard universes. Their plastic wrap perfection draws our attention toward the stain. I love, everyone, the way he frames a policeman in this movie. Do you remember that scene in The Used Car Salesman, where there's just a normal looking used car sequence? There's nothing menacing about this space, ostensibly, but the camera keeps cutting to what seems to be a point of view from Marion's perspective, when the policeman is just standing there, you know, and with his glasses, his sunglasses, we can't see his eyes. So here, even the policeman, this force of authority and of quote unquote protection, though Hitchcock has noted his root fear was the police, which I think is very interesting. But it's all to sort of say, how do you see Psycho beyond the scene I just mentioned with this kind of the police, evoking that stain on normality and within a picture perfect universe? And so Hitchcock was very aware that his cinema was all about evoking complicity in the suffering displayed. And talking with Dick Cavett, and this is again for the release of Frenzy, Hitchcock noted how everyone laughs at a man in a top hat who falls down a manhole. If the audience were to hang on the scene for a moment longer, they would confront the violence and tragedy of the once uproarious scene. Hitchcock mused, and this is a mix of metaphor and touch, everyone, quote, think how ashamed that audience is, that they laughed in the first place, and yet they do. Slipping on a banana peel is very painful, so there is a streak of cruelty among everyone. And he told Cavett that his enjoyment as an artist comes from showing audiences, quote, that they will enjoy themselves in a particular way at that time. I call it dipping their toes in the cold water of fear. So while both in the video that I found this quote in, they both, the host and audience, laugh away the point, I think it has grave implications for us, Anthony, when we understand Hitchcock. Hitchcock hinted here that the cold waters of fear that he encouraged us to dip our toes are cooled by our own cruel desires. And so, what are the security of our parents? So let me offer you some interesting moments in the film where Hitchcock shows the stain in our homes beyond Norman Bates. And Norman Bates is not the only person in this world with a close relationship with his mother, tinged with the discomforting presence of the erotic. And everyone, because we have psychiatrists in the room, I'll be very curious for further readings on this kind of the pop psychology that I'm presenting in these moments, or how you would read this through a psychiatric lens. So sex and the family is suggested in the first scene. Do you remember, everyone, when Marion mentions an ideal sort of dinner where her lover and sister eat a steak dinner with, and there's a photo of mother watching? And after that, Marion notes, oh, we can see each other, or during that, we can see each other. We can even have dinner, but respectively in my house with my mother's picture on the mantle. And then Sam later says, and after the steak, forgive the imitations, everyone. And after the steak, do we send sister to the movies, turn mama's picture to the wall? It's here where Marion claims, quote, you make respect. That's really important to understand Hitchcock's cinema, both in this film and more broadly. It's about the way in which there is something disrespectful, something unsettling about even the most respectable family units that on the surface look normal. Hitchcock I wanted to, and I'll just do a brief close reading, Anthony, before moving to draw further links to Hitchcock cinema before closing. Hitchcock with his cameo, which is linked to his daughter. Do you all remember that receptionist? That's Pat Hitchcock talking. And you might say it's just a coincidence, but I think it deepens the metaphor of this moment. And I'll be curious for everyone's thoughts. For time, I won't show the clip. It's in the YouTube. It's in the slide, the YouTube link. But I think he further links the family with suspicions toward and or fears of sex. So notice or remember everyone what the doctor is talking about. Excuse me, what the daughter is talking about. So we have what happens. I'll make this image bigger so everyone can see it. So we see the visual link from Father Hitchcock, who's on that left image. Do you see him wearing a cowboy hat? She parenthetically, I was reading the IMDb, Anthony, he wanted to get his cameo out of the way so people would focus on the movie. And that gives you a sign of just how big the auteur Hitchcock was. That they're like, who cares about the suspense movie? I want to Where's Waldo it and see if I can see Hitch. But so we see the visual link here from Father Hitchcock to Daughter Hitchcock, achieved by the camera pan from right to left. And again, this reading sort of relies on our behind the scenes knowledge of the casting here. But again, I think Hitchcock, by encouraging us to find his cameo, is always encouraging us throughout his career to think behind the scenes, to go beyond the surface of the images presented. And I would say, in a kind of foreshadowing what would happen between Norman and Mother, I guess the two sides of his psyche. Notably, we can see here, Marion is the visual link between the parent and child here. So again, it is interesting that Marion, even in this very opening sequence, or in this early sequence, once again brings in questions of sexuality and the family. And so she complains about her headache. So what does the mother and tranquilizer's tale suggest to you all about the relationship between parent and child over the question of sex? Look at, so this is in the next shot, one of the next shots. My mother's daughter gave them to me the day of my wedding. And then with a smile, a devilish smile, Pat Hitchcock, the receptionist character, looks up and says, Teddy was furious when he found out I'd taken tranquilizers. So what do we make of that moment? The way in which the mother was trying to encourage her daughter to have sex through a medically induced rigor mortis. Again, I don't know if that's totally fair as a term, Anthony. So, but I'll be curious. This sense of like just lie there. And also, you sort of see that I'm cooking on this element of the two Hitchcocks in this scene, the two generations of Hitchcock. So, what does the presence of the two Hitchcocks add to this metaphor, to this kind of stain that sexuality presents between parent and child? And again, I wanted to highlight for everyone, Anthony, that this is a theme in Hitchcock's cinema, the close relationships with their mothers beyond Norman Bates. So for instance, in the later film Frenzy, the serial rapist murderer says his mother would quote the blonde bombshell, Mae West, quote, Beulah, peel me a grape. Hitchcock associated blonde stars and his mother too. These are, I should say, divergent. This is not the same interview, but this is just from a collection of quotes from Hitchcock, but I found it interesting nonetheless to consider the psychology. So on Ingrid Bergman's habit of wearing gloves, excuse me, everyone, that should be right. He said, quote, I thought it was very sexy, the way she took them off. I always thought it was more sexy if a woman reveals her secrets gradually, rather than indulging in overexposure. On his mother's habits of wearing gloves, quotes, my mother was meticulous about her home and her person. She never left the house without presenting herself at her best, her posture, her demeanor, her dress, her shoes, perfectly polished, well-kept handbag, inside as well as outside, and gloves whenever possible. I have always admired a lady who wears gloves. And so again, this is Farid doing some cheeky, for the sake of our conversation, Anthony, some cheeky juxtapositions. But it is interesting to me that he has quoted as saying that there's an eroticism to gloves with Bergman. Something sexy, and so thinking about that eroticism, what do we take and make of a director, Anthony, very invested in fraught, quasi-incestuous relationships with children and mothers or children and parents? what do we make of this? I'm always admiring a lady who wears gloves. And so my final note for everyone before we kick it to you, Anthony, and thank you everyone for your patience as I quickly ran through some of my observations. But we have seen how the mother in Psycho, at least performed by Norman, is widowed, angry, and assails her child with rebukes when the sexual comes up. Uh, so I was wondering, would Norman's performance of hers suggest an underlying incestuous violence within the mother and or housewife figure? And it should be noted that we also see the housewife in a great scene with the sheriff or the deputy sheriff, who describes making the violence, giving testimony, choosing out what the dead mother will wear, periwinkle blue dress. It is interesting to me that the housewife is clearly normalizing this violence and comfortable with it. In Frenzy, the housewife of a police inspector enjoys imagining the motivations of the rapist strangler when talking about a case. Unlike the police inspector, she smiles and enjoys, the possibility of manipulating bodies. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight this. That last shot. Do you remember that pan, Anthony? That pan to Norman Bates at the end of the film when he declares in his mother's voice, or when his mother declares, "Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly." Anthony, that comes from an episode of Revenge, where we have a housewife who kills her husband from a few years earlier, everyone, with a leg of lamb. And we have that pull into the smiling housewife, smiling at the possibility that everyone is enjoying her leg of lamb and doesn't suspect her. So again, Hitchcock, throughout his cinema, is thinking about the potential violence of the housewife figure, as well as the way in which she presents a facade of innocence. No one would ever suspect her. And I think that's what's so striking about Hitchcock cinema, is that it's a cinema, Anthony, that encourages us to look beyond the surface, to see the facade and find ways to trace and put our fingers on the stain. So those are my opening thoughts, everyone. I'll be curious, Anthony, what you and others have to say.
Oh, thank you. A lot to choose from. So I think to begin, to add another layer to this, Hitchcock himself was, for lack of a better word, perhaps obsessed with a particular case at the time that largely inspired this work, perhaps a work of sublimation. And that is the case of Ed Gein. Ed Gein's case from Wisconsin was the inspiration for not only Psycho, but a couple of other movies as well, and therefore a couple of other movie characters beyond Norman Bates, right? So that's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's Leatherface. That is also The Silence of the Lambs, that's Hannibal Lecter, and really to a greater extent, Buffalo Bill, right? So some very iconic movies inspired from the Gein case. And I think the film starring, ironically, I mentioned Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins. There's another movie called Hitchcock, also starring an actor, that really gets into Hitchcock's obsession and focus on the Ed Gein case and his delving into horror, really for the first time in his career in the production of Psycho, right? So it's a pretty cool film to watch. How historically accurate it is, I can't attest to. It was actually before my time. But it is a very interesting idea of how these movies, including Psycho, was inspired by real life events. And those are the events of Ed Gein, a notorious serial killer and body snatcher who exhumed individuals and, similar to Buffalo Bill, made clothes and different trinkets with them, right? So, and of course, Norman Bates, taxidermy, right? So that was the inspiration. When you look a little bit further into the Ed Gein case, a couple of things happen. Number one is when his father and brother mysteriously die, and the backstory of Norman is that there is a similar context. That's really Bates Motel TV series. Dad, brother mysteriously die. That's kind of teased out. His mother becomes his best friend, and that's actually stated as such. This is Augusta Gein, who is known to be very domineering, very cold, and really would not allow Ed out of the house, especially when it came to intimacy. She became his best friend, and you can look up on Murderpedia, other resources, is that relationship is actually described as such. When Ed Gein is apprehended, I think provisional diagnosis is schizophrenia. And from this is kind of born the term the schizophrenogenic mother. To what extent did Augusta Gein induce this behavior that later on becomes known, at least in this particular case, as schizophrenia? Of course, this was not the discovery of the illness, right? That took place way before the Ed Gein case. But the schizophrenic mother kind of arises in part from the behavior and therefore the actions of one Ed Gein. And to the extent that Alfred Hitchcock bases his story or is inspired by this very case, Norma Bates and her behavior really gets this to the national eye, right? Because unless you're in psychiatry or otherwise forensics, you probably don't know much about Ed Gein, but everybody knows about Norma Bates, at least in the 1960s. Right? And all of a sudden, we see a trend in psychiatry where mom gets blamed for this condition called schizophrenia. We have concepts like the double bind, which is employed by both Norma as well as Augusta. And because of that, the schizophrenic mother, which I have to, God bless you, I have to say, for certainly educational value, has been debunked. We do not believe mom caused schizophrenia anymore. There is no such thing as the schizophrenic mother, period, right? It's for historical value, especially in discussing films like Psycho, right? So that's where this whole thing can start in looking at a case of schizophrenia. Now, I don't think Norman Bates has the condition called schizophrenia. I don't think he is necessarily hallucinating, delusional, or otherwise has any other negative or positive symptoms that would not be attributed to or explained by dissociative identity disorder. That's the big reveal at the end of this movie. Spoiler alert, right? So I don't think he has schizophrenia, although I believe the movie and its script is based on a case of schizophrenia and an overly sensationalized one at that. And that, again, is the case of Ed Gein. So that's where I think this conversation starts. And with a lot of the other information that's been provided, this really provides that nidus to really investigate those additional questions. But before I get to that, and I have some ideas, any questions about anything I just presented? And this is also back to the folks back in Texas, as well as in the room.
Yeah, does any of my students have questions for Anthony at this time on this on the medical side?
We got it. Something in the chat saying not here. So I think we're safe to proceed.
Can I ask one basic question? Yes. And anyone can jump in, but what is, so it's called Psycho. You know, you talk a lot about schizophrenia, and it's the movie's called Psycho. And I'm just curious, is that a framework that we can understand? You know, I think in popular parlance, there's like this psychopath, and I'm just curious, how do you understand the term?
Let's actually agree. Okay. The term psycho will be an abbreviation for psychosis.
Okay, I see.
Which, of course, which schizophrenia is but one example, right? So schizophrenia is the mental illness. The overall descriptor would be psychosis. And
I see.
Yeah, short would be, or abbreviated would be psycho.
Thank you for that.
And there's emerging evidence to suggest, even though this movie is a fictional case of DID, right? Formerly known as multiple personality disorder. And we'll get into what that is in just a little bit. There is emerging evidence to suggest that a majority of people that have dissociative disorders do experience psychotic symptoms at some point in their life, and vice versa. Individuals with dissociative disorders do tend to demonstrate psychosis, especially positive symptoms. And that's recent evidence, and that is in the current medical literature. So this idea of a chapter being named schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, and then a separate chapter published in that same DSM titled The Dissociative Disorders. That's probably going to be outdated fairly soon with the emerging evidence, and these two chapters are likely to combine because of the shared neurobiology. Now, there's still some differences, sure, but the emerging evidence suggests that there's a lot shared here, and as we look at different functional MRI studies, et cetera, those chapters are likely to be integrated. So the hallmark illness here is schizophrenia, to my knowledge, and of course, I did not provide any of this interview, so I cannot say with any certainty. That was the diagnosis that Ed Gein received upon his arrest, right? In terms of what he did and what his behaviors manifested. This is a condition in which individuals struggle with perceptual disturbances such as hallucinations, and as well as delusions, which are fixed beliefs that do not have any bearing or do not adhere to reality testing. There's also some disorganization of thought process or speech, as well as disorganization of one's behavior. And then there's another constellation of symptoms, which we refer to as negative symptomology. So all the other examples were the pathological presence of something that at baseline should not be there. Negative symptomology is the exact opposite. It's the pathological absence of something that at baseline should in fact be there. So the absence of speech, alogia, is considered to be a negative symptom consistent with, among other illnesses, schizophrenia, right? So that's the quick, skinny, the definition of that condition, schizophrenia. Again, a condition that I do not think Norman Bates has, although he does demonstrate evidence of psychosis, as many people with DID do, perhaps lending to the actual title of this movie. Let's talk about DID, because that's the big reveal here. Just to make sure we have some nosology and get some clinical terms understood. Individuals with this condition, abbreviated DID for dissociative identity disorder, have a distinct personality state that takes over their conscious awareness. And they do so because of early childhood trauma for the most part. The more severe the trauma, the more likely the hypothalamus is going to freeze than fight or flight. And while that might be life-preserving to the 5-year-old or 6-year-old, when the individual turns the age of Norman, those same exact strategies, those same exact signs and symptoms become a pathology and no longer a way to cope. Okay, so again, in the midst of a trauma, an individual's hypothalamus can have that fear response, fight or flight, but is a third option when neither A nor B is realistic. And that's freeze or dissociation. When that happens, our endogenous opiates flood our central nervous system. Indolamines such as serotonin flood our central nervous system. An individual can actually go to a quote safe space so as not to integrate the memory of what is actually happening because it is so traumatic. Right? Individuals after the event are very likely to become amnestic over that event because of their degree of dissociation, the most severe of which is to actually have an altered state of consciousness synthesize that experience, not only lending to amnesia, but perhaps also resulting in a distinct personality state that actually could recur. This is a chronic illness. So my question, getting back to really what Fareed had initially presented with regard to sexuality in the family, was Norman Bates actually a victim of early childhood sexual trauma? And during that trauma, did he dissociate? And if so, is Psycho, the film, an actual fictional case of that adaptive response turned maladaptive? We'd have to write the prequel. We don't know, right? But that's certainly suggested. Quickly, if an individual in this situation does not have a distinct personality state that takes over the conscious awareness, but still is amnestic from or of that early childhood abuse, that is called dissociative amnesia. And if the patient, the person, we'll call him Norman, has neither of the above, but as a result of that trauma, feels disconnected to themselves and or their surroundings, that's the final, albeit mildest form of dissociative disorder called depersonalization/derealization disorder. So those are the three main conditions you have to consider in terms of diagnosing individuals struggling with dissociation, such as Norman. Of course, the ending of this film, I think, is fairly straightforward in that he is struggling with DID, the most severe form of the illness. I'll briefly pause. Questions about schizophrenia or any of the dissociative disorders?
The creation of the alter after the traumatic event, is that always going to be at a fixed level of maturity from that time?
Usually, yes. Okay, so there's no real answer here because the cases of DID are so rare that there really is no scientific way to really study them, much less provide an evidence-based response. But for the most part, if you talk to traumatologists, yes, individuals who have an alter usually have that alter's age and maturity remain static. Okay. Traumatology will also tell you, again, this is not an exact science, that the age of the youngest alter is likely the age of the trauma that created that alter, right? When DID, or even created the illness itself, when DID actually first manifests, right? And that, not to get too much on a tangent, is everything that's wrong with M. Night Shyamalan's Split, right? Because we told in one part of this movie that Kevin Crumb experienced trauma at the age of 3, yet Hedwig is 9. Okay. When we talk about Split, I'll get you my conspiracy theory of what the heck is going on there, but that's a little bit beyond today's scope. But certainly another film about DID.
May I ask a particular question about relating DID to a wrinkle in the Bates performance, or in the Perkins performance, that I was curious about, Anthony?
Absolutely.
I don't know if you were all struck by this, but I really enjoyed this. There was one moment where and I'm just curious what you, because when you posed the question, was he a victim of early psychological sexual trauma? And as you said, when you reminded us, hey everyone, this is gestured towards in the film. And it, I went back and looked at the script, and after there's this moment, Anthony, where she goes, by candlelight, I suppose, in the cheap erotic fashion of young men with cheap erotic minds. And so this is, kind of underlining this notion of eroticism. So eroticism is present, which does, I think, suggest Mrs. Bates's, kind of sexual appetite, which is, gestured towards as a reason for her death later on. But at one point, I was struck, and I don't know if you have any sort of clinical analysis of what's happening here, but you see the script in the note shared on screen. He imitates mother. She's just a stranger, and I just found that to be really interesting. That in inhabiting Bates, Mrs. Bates, he's able to vocalize the way in which, and I don't know if this is fair articulation, Anthony, everyone, but it seems like he's able to vocalize how he perceives how Mrs. Bates saw him. In this case, as a kind of sycophantic boy. Mother, she's just a stranger. But I just love the mise en abîme, or the mirrors upon mirrors moment there. And I was just wondering if you had thoughts in terms of what that might reveal about the complexities of DID, where a person can not only inhabit two selves, but they can also inhabit one self commenting upon the other. Do you have any thoughts on that, Anthony?
Yeah, again, and as rare as this condition is, that can happen. So when the alters actually manifest, they have their own personality traits, they have their own memories, and if you believe some literature, even their own biomarkers. Right. So that's been published. So we actually can see that happen. There is certainly no consistency to this, though. Right. These are case reports. They are published in medical journals, but they are case reports. They should never be confused, for obvious reasons, and we all know why, with double-blinded placebo-controlled studies. Right. So take what it's worth and be ready to critically analyze that literature, and be critical, always be critical anyway, when you're discussing aspects of a very, very, very rare illness such as this. Right. But yeah, that certainly can happen. That
Mm.
absolutely can happen. Uh-oh, we're in trouble here. I'm gonna have to take a quick break and run to my office to get an extension. We have a power emergency. Give me 90 seconds.
Of course.
You guys gonna fill in with anything or Fareed, please take the mic.
Sure, everyone. So we have this really wonderful, and I appreciate for the medical students in the room and the medical professionals. I, coming from, as you can tell, a very humanities approach, am really intrigued by, when we get into the nitty gritty that Anthony is offering us in terms of the psychology of these characters. I think I would be curious if anyone has any questions on my thoughts and or comments or thoughts, and keeping in mind that those from us at Texas Tech are coming from this more humanities lens rather than a medical lens. But if anyone else had any specific thoughts on this question, which I don't know if I've fully verbalized like this, but did you see that? How did you see the film was suggesting that Norman Bates was a victim of early psychological sexual trauma? So does anyone have any questions in the room for me broadly about my remarks, or any further thoughts on how the movie might be giving us some evidence to see Norman Bates as having suffered a sexual trauma outside from his mother's hand? Any thoughts, any comments or questions that anyone wants to share?
I have a thought.
Hey, hello. Please go ahead.
So, and I want to bring in a little bit of theory here, which is fair
Mhm.
on a shelf exam. And we'll decide whether or not this kind of rises to the level of a sexual trauma or if it's further evidence of. And that is, I think that Norman Bates is stagnated or fixated at or around the age of 5. Right? If I were to be in therapy with Norman Bates, while we're not going to go there day one, certainly my anticipation would be to explore early childhood experiences. And my gut says we need to get back to at or around the age of 5. Primarily, this is where the Oedipal complex is resolved, right? And along those lines, we kind of alluded to this already. He is, there's quote unquote sexuality in the family dynamic, and that's normal, right? The tagline from this movie, and unfortunately, it's going to be a tagline that I'm going to have to paraphrase, and perhaps Fareed, you can actually correct me. A boy's best friend is his mother. By the way, that line was actually used to describe Ed Gein too.
Whoa.
Right, and to some extent that's true. But what Freud does is he kind of takes that to the next level. A boy's first intimate relationship is with his mother. It's the first time a boy understands that there's an opposite sex. And that is at or around the age of 5. That is the Oedipal phase, right? That's the Oedipal complex during the phallic phase of psychosexual development as per Freud. So that's normal. What appears to be happening here is you have an adult that is regressing back to that point. For some reason, it appears that Norman Bates has not successfully resolved the Oedipal complex, right? That's what this movie's really about, right? That's why there's so much sexuality between the family unit here, is because if you focus on the character of Norman Bates, he is actually fixated there per a Sigmund Freud perspective, from a psychosexual perspective. You also actually talked about the surface versus the interior. I found those to be just synonymous words with the persona. That's a Jungian term. In later development of Freud's theory, the ego was actually given some conscious awareness, right? The surface. The interior, of course, in psychology and psychiatry is the subconscious, where our id and our superego actually operate. And it's that id impulse that is being repressed in that 5-year-old boy, because for the first time there's intimate feelings, right? And there's the wish to kill one's father and possess one's mother, as per the textbook written by Sigmund Freud, right? As per the textbook per Sigmund Freud. We don't know how Ed Gein's father died. And we really aren't given much, albeit leave it to suspicion, on how Norman Bates's father dies. But boy, is it right in line with the Oedipal complex, that idinal subconscious wish to kill the father so as to possess mom, right? That's a 5-year-old's, albeit subconscious wish. And that's the Oedipal complex. That causes anxiety. And more specifically, that causes castration anxiety. So, and I think that directly links to the tranquilizer scene that you showed us in the slide, right? If tranquilizers, there's got to be anxiety, right? I mean, I don't think the word tranquilizers, AKA sedative hypnotics, are going to be introduced in a clinical sense without there being anxiety for which they're indicated. And if that's the case, and that's the case for this particular person, the type of anxiety I think that Norman Bates continues to struggle with is castration anxiety, that anxiety that is normal when developmentally appropriate, and that is at the age of 5. Right. So this movie is about regression back to that Oedipal stage for Norman Bates.
Anthony, do you feel, I love this, it's so helpful to hear kind of what, that the tranquilizers sort of suggests anxiety, and the film establishes very early on, through these scenes that these anxieties are not, and maybe this is part of the value of the film's broad troubled sexuality within the family, i.e. that Bates is not the only one that has a quote unquote a difficulty with these questions, is to sort of say this is foundationally human, and so like this is a way in which Bates might serve as a model, Anthony, for us to start thinking about, like, wait, how these kind of horror film cases, how does this broadly allow us to understand these various anxieties? And so it makes me and I so appreciate you breaking down the questions of a surface and interior through a psychoanalytic vocabulary or a medical vocabulary. But it makes me want to ask, I was also, it's such an interesting performance, the Bates performance, in part because it seems like, to your point, I get his stagnation at the age of 5, and indeed he seems to be eating Cracker Jacks at some point. We never see him, and he makes a sandwich. We never see him like make a meal. And he seems to be very oriented towards chores. It's a Friday, is linen day. But I was wondering what you and others thought about. There is another line and another tension in his performance where I do think he sometimes vacillates between this age of 5, the stagnation, and there's that he can't even say the word bathroom, and there's this moment where, and there's a seductive edge, I think, to the scene where Miriam asks him to come into his bedroom, to eat dinner. But I noticed that in that great scene where it's largely just close-ups of these two actors really going to town and having a conversation about these anxieties, what do you make of the line, Anthony and everyone, a son is a poor substitute for a lover? And because it made me think, like, this almost suggested a really strong awareness on the part of Bates, where he is stagnated in so many aspects of his personality. But I did also wonder if he uses the stagnation as a way to, and I don't know how to put this in medical terms, so I'll rely on you in your class, but like it almost makes it seem like he's performing a regressed masculinity to draw women closer. And there's that moment where he's like, okay, go to shower, and then when he pulls off again all the layers of the wall, right? He pulls off all the kind of picture perfect paintings so that he can watch this woman bathe. And so I do wonder, like, what do you make of that particular line of son is a poor substitute for a lover in terms of thinking about Bates' self-awareness? And also, how do you understand this kind of psychic stagnation as potentially a vehicle by which the Bates character can, or as a kind of social strategy, an insidious one, that he can use that as a means to cultivate different kinds of female or erotic intimacy?
Yeah, I think that comment is definitely indicative of and consistent with the view that he is stagnated or fixated at Oedipal stage. I think that's further support of that. It's hard to get by that. The second part of your question, though, is even more intriguing. My feel, and again, I would love and value feedback, is that it is not a conscious effort. I do think,
Ah.
especially where the Oedipal complex sits, it has to be subconscious.
Mm.
However, there's another aspect to this, which I will readily agree with it being a mechanism for his preying on women. And that is that while subconscious, it still guides and motivates his behavior. And when it's used, and in his view, success is achieved through mechanisms of operant conditioning, it's going to strengthen, right? So I do think there's a conscious component to this, even though the motivation is subconscious. I think the motivation is the Oedipal complex. It is subconscious. Its behavioral manifestation is actually rewarded and therefore positively reinforced and therefore strengthened. And it's important to recognize, because in psychiatry, we were often taught to think biopsychosocially, and I don't want anybody to stop thinking along the biopsychosocial model of human behavior, and therefore the biopsychosocial model of abnormal human behavior. That's got to stick. What I want you to do, starting with your clerkship, is to incorporate yet another perspective and merge the two. And that is, think through different factors that can predispose, precipitate, and even perpetuate behavior. And when you think that way, especially following a psychiatric assessment, if you build a 3x3 rubric, the 3 Ps along the y-axis and biopsychosocial the x-axis, you can then retranscribe your notes into those 9 boxes and have a real good idea of why the individual did what they did and why they continue to do what they're doing, right? Perpetuating behavior. When you think about those terms, the operant conditioning principles, the rewards that he gets, are part of psychological perpetuating factors, right? And that's the way I like to frame this. That makes sense? So I don't know, Fareed, I don't know if that made sense to you. But...
No, absolutely. Because I do think, like, because I was struggling watching the performance. I mean, in an exciting way. I was struggling with what seemed to, like, he even uses scripts, you know, like, and when he's talking with Marion, he's like, I didn't realize that how scripted he was when he was like, you know, 12 vacancies, 12 rooms. You know what I mean? And then when the couple arrives and he's not he doesn't see the possibility to fully take on to fully prey on the Vera Miles character because there's a man sitting there. What I did notice was, like, there definitely, he even says the same jokes. He goes, did you notice, Anthony? He says it in a much more bored fashion. 12 vacancies, 12 rooms, you know. And so he definitely seems to be operating on scripts in terms of how he engages. And I wonder if that's in part that the aggressive edge that you're describing. This is not someone who wants, or is maybe even capable of presenting himself in a way that, at least in a socially acceptable way. I do think when he gets into clucking their tongues, like that sequence does suggest, I wondered if in some ways the regressed ideal is a safe ideal, because there's that moment when he leans in and he goes, a madhouse. So he seems to be talking about his own experience, it seems, with being put into institutions. And I noticed that even the level of his language was much more aggressive, but it was also much more refined. And it almost felt like an adult was talking there, where, you know, I can't remember the exact lines, but like clucking their tongues and saying, because he all of a sudden is pointing to Miriam an awareness of how people repress themselves. I.e., they can't talk about the intimacy of, or the social taboo of an institution, describing it as "quote unquote" someplace. So I think this is really helping me understand what seems to be the variety of basis performance, sort of social performance, from a much more regressed state all the way to what seems to be quite canny in terms of understanding the social no-goes at work, specifically in regards, and I don't know how you respond to this, Anthony, but he seems to be very aware of the taboo surrounding mental health. And he catches himself with Miriam and is just like, oh, do you want to have a sandwich? He tries to come back to that regressed and or asexual performance. but it seems like the mask has slipped in an interesting way. So it seems like this character is, to your point, stagnated at the age of 5, but at the same time seems to. Would you agree that there are moments of kind of lucidity and or where that persona breaks down, even when he is operating or performing as Norman Bates?
No, no, I agree. And I think there's a great comment in the chat room as well as to what might also describe this. And along these lines, I think we've mentioned a couple of things that we probably should kind of attempt to link together at this point.
Okay.
So we're looking at early childhood experiences, and we're kind of getting an idea of how those childhood experiences may have impacted adult behavior in the character of Norman Bates. For his part, I'm trying to think. Oh, by the way, I'm going to end up ending this with a question, and just so everybody knows, our live feed has stopped, so everybody should feel a little bit more comfortable answering this question, whereas maybe in just 20 seconds ago they may not have, and that includes people in this room. Generally speaking, when an individual is around the age of 5, and there is that curiosity of how I am different than other, how might a child kind of explore those differences and satisfy their curiosity? Because not only autoarousal, right? I'm talking about autoarousal and I am different than other. What and I could also share with you, especially since we're no longer live streaming, this comes up in therapy fairly often. So how might that actually take effect? How might that exploration actually happen? 5-year-old.
I imagine, is it naive to say, but like you have autoarousal, but also seeking out opportunities for voyeurism? Do you know, like, I sometimes wonder if that's what a child would do, find a hole in the wall and take a look at what's behind,
Exactly right. Exactly right. And I've had more than one therapy patient talk about how as a child they peek through a peephole. And I mean a keyhole, right? Not that they actually bored a hole in the wall or have a hidden room or something like that. So yes, that's exactly what happens here. And I don't think it's any irony that he not only has a peephole, but he can't say the word bathroom. If they came up in a therapy session, there's not an MD with a license that would say, "Nah, I want to explore that." You absolutely would explore it. And to the extent that it's causing clinically significant distress or impairment in an adult, you'd have to explore it to resolve that anxiety. So the fact that Norman Bates has a peephole in his office and can actually see her bathing and can't say the word bathroom gives us, I think, very solid direction as to what, as a therapist, we should explore that might be causing or at least impacting all of this adult behavior. Yeah, he was exploring, and there was some voyeurism, which at the age of 5 is considered to be completely normal. But with the unsuccessful resolution of the Oedipal complex, it's now occurring at the age of 25, which is not normal, right? Perhaps even illegal in most states. Right.
I love that. I think like that sense of, again, Freud in his essay on the uncanny talks about, the uncanny is the familiar defamiliarized, or the Heimlich, the home, becoming unheimlich. And so I think the Freud essay, which I use to teach horror because it's such a great lens into understanding what is creepy, at least in popular movies, I think you're highlighting this way in which this what was once normal as a child for Bates, or Norman for Norm is, Norm is even in his name. What was once normal is now being twisted. So I love that articulation of the way in which this voyeuristic impulse becomes a pathology when it is seen through the adult eye, be it Bates or Hitchcock. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, Mirindi noted, added a further reading as to maybe articulating why his vocabulary is able to increase. Mirindi even while he stays in this regress psychic state, everyone, where Marindi writes, if he is at a regress state, couldn't his polished language indicate children repeating what adults say without actually realizing what the words indicate? I'll be curious, Anthony, for your thoughts on that. And then Bailey has a medical question for the group. When someone has DID, do they always take on the personality of someone they know or have known, like how Norman takes on the personality of his mother? Do you have any thoughts on either Marindi's reading, Anthony, or on Bailey's question?
Yeah. So the first comment I think is very accurate. That absolutely does happen. That's just modeling.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes, that becomes pathological to the extent that the individual, usually a child during development, is in fact just parroting and doesn't understand the meaning behind the words. And I think we see that more and more now with emerging technologies. The babysitter now is YouTube, and a lot of kids just say what they hear on YouTube with no substance behind it or fully understanding what topics they're actually discussing. And to the extent that there are no parental guides, that conversation really can go anywhere in 2022. We see that very, very often in our clinics. So the answer is yes. And to that extent, and to the extent that that was demonstrated in this film, Hitchcock is way ahead of his time. The question, when someone has DID, do they always take on the personality of someone they know? Absolutely not. No. Matter of fact, that's rare. The case of Norman Bates is actually demonstrative of a rare case. It's usually not someone they know. It's usually an alter that has a personality or persona that is somehow reflective or addressing what they need most. So, for instance, there might be the protector, there might be the jester, different personas that manifest depending on the situation in which they developed. But very rarely is it actually somebody they know.
It's striking to me like that, the way in which the film sort of emphasizes that Norman only can imitate his mother, and that there isn't. He has, it seems, a real difficulty of imitating anyone else. And I think there's even a sense that the Norman Bates, because Marindi offered, through the framework of parroting that you've described, Anthony, offered us a great way to understand, the way in which his vocabulary might, leap. You can imagine his mother talking about institutions in a similar way, as an example. But like, I'm beginning to sort of understand too through this conversation that there, it almost seems like with the idea that certain personas, like the mother persona, seems to be really, how do you say, really rigid and really concrete, really concretized, really crystallized. There is no slip, and I don't know if DID works that way, where you have like a secondary persona or a persona that is you can have much more control over. And even at one point, he lifts her corpse, and brings her downstairs. And so like, and she even says, "I can use my legs," but it seems like that's that visual metaphor of him holding the sight of his persona, his mother, and being able to move her easily and being able to hide her. Like, he seems to have a lot of command over the mother Bates persona, but his own persona seems to slip, seems to fall into, when he's talking with Arbogast. Like, that's interesting, 2 weeks, you said that there was no couple that came in. Like, it's so wonderful watching. The Arbogast delivers a great performance. If it doesn't stick, it ain't aspic. What does it say? It ain't aspic, and it doesn't. If it doesn't gel, it ain't aspic, and it doesn't gel. But I was so interesting. Like, Arbogast, I don't know what you and others think, was able to identify the way in which Norman doesn't seem to have a command over himself. Can't control how he's being read. Like, he's presenting, I think, a regressed personality to the detective, and the detective just asks him straight out, "Did you sleep with her?" And I wonder if in some ways is that, the genesis of sometimes with the idea of multiple personas. Do you agree that he has more command over the mother character? And beyond that, is that a potentially why people create these alternative personas? So they have a persona that they can totally control how they're being perceived, or at least in their own imagination, how they're being perceived and what they project, Anthony.
Yeah, so that's less likely. That's
Okay.
rare. Usually individuals demonstrate clinically significant distress because they don't have that control.
Ooh.
There's no way to control when that persona might actually, or that altered state of consciousness can actually spontaneously take over the conscious awareness. And that lends to significant distress and functional impairment. So that is very rare. Although I think X-Men, there is a way that they actually capture that. Do anybody here X-Men fan? Okay, right. So I'll find that out. I'll tell you guys if you guys are interested. So quick X-Men reference. I'll have to figure that one out, but I think there's a keyboard in which they actually do it. That's not in this, and it's not in real life either, but it would be cool. And I saw a comment too. Yes, the regression back to an altered state of consciousness was also seen in Pamela Voorhees when she actually became Jason. And again, whether we think she has true DID or whether she is psychotic is certainly up for discussion. But I think that ultimately, maybe 5 years from now, we're going to say both because of the shared neurobiology. Any other thoughts, questions about anything we talked? We covered a lot of stuff today. So, any thoughts? What's happening? We're probably gonna have to end here. We have a 1:30 case conference.
Oh boy.
Any final questions from the group back in Texas?
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Jennifer. Anyone from my classes have any further either thoughts or questions they want to share with either Anthony or me before we close?
We're good.
It looks like we've intellectually sated everyone. So yeah, it looks like we're good. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Anthony, to have us into your wonderful class.
Thanks to you. Again, thanks for the very refreshing perspective and certainly the impetus for these types of discussions. We'll have to connect and do this again.
Oh boy, I can't wait. Let's not wait till next Halloween. It was a real joy.
Oh yeah, no, we won't wait a year. We have to get on top of this. And Fried, if you don't mind, once you get done editing, can you send me a copy of those slides?
Yeah, of course. What I'll do, everyone, is I'll send you, Anthony, the slides with my I'll just add a few parenthetical references along with a works cited page so everyone can take a look at and help me psychologize Hitchcock. And I'll send that to you in the next hour or so, Anthony.
No rush. Thank you so much.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.